When I was a child, dentists always appeared in my imagination as twisted figures, almost like villains from a horror movie. Men and women in white coats who seemed to enjoy the sound of drills, the smell of disinfectant, and the cries of children. In my childish mind, they were not medical professionals, but sadistic monsters who ripped out teeth for their own amusement. Of course, as I grew older, I came to understand that dentists were nothing like that. They were simply people doing their job, helping patients maintain their health. But sometimes the fears of childhood are not so easy to erase. And for me, one evening in adulthood proved that those childhood nightmares were not entirely unfounded, because I experienced a situation that left scars not only on my body, but also deep inside my memory forever. Back then, life was hard. My boyfriend and I had just moved in together, trying to build something new in a town where no one knew us. We came from poor families, the kind where you learned early on that money dictated nearly everything. Whether you could eat properly, whether you had a roof over your head, and even whether you could get medical help when you needed it. We both worked long hours at low-paying jobs, just enough to cover rent and food. There was no extra cushion for emergencies, and certainly not for something like dental care. One evening after finishing work, I felt a sharp pain in one of my teeth. At first, I tried to ignore it. Maybe I was just exhausted. Maybe I had bitten down too hard on something earlier. Or maybe it was one of those aches that would fade overnight. But when I woke the next morning, the pain hadn't disappeared. It had intensified. My gums throbbed, and every attempt to chew sent waves of discomfort through my jaw. I mentioned it to my boyfriend, hoping it would pass in a day or two. But by the following evening, the ache was so unbearable that I could hardly concentrate on my shift. We both knew the problem. Dentists were expensive. We didn't have insurance, and paying out of pocket felt impossible. Rent was due, food prices were rising, and every paycheck seemed to vanish before we even had time to think. But pain doesn't negotiate with your financial situation. By the end of my workday, I could barely speak without feeling stabbing jolts in my jaw. That was when my boyfriend called, his voice filled with a kind of desperate excitement. He told me he had found a cheap dentist in town, someone whose services cost a fraction of what the larger clinics were charging. He had already made me an appointment for 7 o'clock that evening. At first, I felt relief. Maybe this would finally solve the problem. When I arrived at the small clinic, the building looked plain, almost too plain. The sign above the door was old, faded, and the waiting area was dimly lit. Still, the presence of medical posters on the wall gave me some reassurance. I sat down on one of the cracked chairs. Behind the closed door of the main office, I heard voices. A man and a woman, speaking in tones I couldn't quite make out. After about 10 minutes, the door swung open and a woman rushed out, clearly in a hurry. She clutched her bag tightly, but in her haste dropped her wallet onto the floor. Before I could call after her, she was gone, disappearing into the night. Just then, the door opened again, and I heard a pleasant male voice inviting me inside. The man who greeted me was short, middle-aged, and wore a broad, friendly smile that immediately seemed disarming. I mentioned the wallet, and he casually assured me that the woman was a friend of his and that he would return it later. Without questioning him further, I handed it over, assuming it was no big deal. We filled out paperwork, and I explained the pain in my tooth. He cracked a few light-hearted jokes, which momentarily eased my nerves. But then came the first unsettling moment. Instead of sitting down on his stool like every other dentist I had ever seen, he stood very close to me. I tried to focus on the procedure, but suddenly I felt something brush against my arm. At first, I thought it was accidental, maybe his leg or the edge of his coat. But when I shifted slightly to the side, he followed my movement, pressing closer. Then he grabbed my arm firmly and told me not to move. My stomach twisted. I gathered my courage and told him to stop. After a long sigh, he let go, but the warmth of his earlier demeanor vanished. His voice turned cold, almost irritated, and his smile disappeared. The rest of the appointment went by without further incident, but when I stood to leave, he instructed me to return the following week for a checkup. As I stepped outside, I felt his eyes burning into me from the window. His expression wasn't that of a doctor watching a patient leave. It was the glare of someone angry or disappointed, as though I had failed to play along with some unspoken expectation. When I told my boyfriend what had happened, he brushed it off. We couldn't afford another clinic, and he thought I was just imagining things out of nervousness. Besides, the toothache had eased a little, so despite my discomfort, I agreed to return for the second appointment. That next week, my anxiety was suffocating, but the dentist greeted me again with the same wide smile, acting as if nothing strange had ever happened. This time, he actually sat on his stool, seeming more professional. For a while, I began to think maybe I had overreacted. But then, in the middle of his work, he said something that made my blood run cold. "Hey, I really like your body. You're just my type." I froze. With my mouth full of tools, I could only mumble something neutral, trying to diffuse the situation. As my eyes darted nervously around the room, I noticed something sitting on his desk, the exact same wallet the woman had dropped the week before. My pulse quickened. That wallet should have been returned by now. Why was it still there? Before I could gather my thoughts, he invited me to his apartment for tea after the appointment. I declined immediately, telling him I had a boyfriend. He waved it off, insisting, "It's just tea. He won't know." I refused again, but his insistence grew sharper, more aggressive. His hand tightened around the dental drill, and as he pressed it into my tooth, the sharp pain made me cry out. He leaned closer and repeated in a low, forceful voice, "You'll come with me, won't you? Just for tea, just for tea." Fear gripped me. With sharp instruments inside my mouth, one wrong move could lead to serious harm. My tears began to fall. Finally, trembling, I whispered, "Okay, I'll go." The transformation in his face was instant. His grin returned, cheerful and sweet, as if the menace of the last few minutes had never happened. But when he turned away to grab another instrument, something inside me snapped. My fight or flight instinct roared to life. I reached for the nearest object I could grab and struck him with it. The shock bought me just enough time to leap out of the chair and sprint out of the clinic. I didn't look back. I ran for several blocks, terrified that he might chase after me. Only when I stopped to catch my breath did I realize something was terribly wrong. My mouth was filled with blood. The drill had gone too deep into my gums, damaging one of my teeth beyond repair. When I touched the spot with my tongue, I felt the jagged ruin where a healthy tooth had been. Back home, I collapsed into tears as I told my boyfriend everything. This time, he couldn't dismiss it. He rushed me to the police and then to the state dental clinic, where real professionals examined me. Their verdict was grim. The tooth was unsalvageable and had to be removed entirely. With no insurance, I couldn't afford an implant. The empty space in my mouth became a permanent reminder of that nightmarish experience. The police went to investigate, but the dentist claimed it had all been a medical mistake. He said I was lying, that I had misunderstood his intentions. The justice system failed me. Instead of serious charges, he was given only a fine of a few $1,000s, and unbelievably, he was allowed to keep his clinic open. Haunted by the memory of the wallet, I asked the police what had become of the woman who dropped it. After some hesitation, they admitted she had been reported missing around the same time I had first seen her. That was all they would say. To this day, I can't erase the image of that smiling man standing too close, or the chill of his voice as he pressed the drill deeper into my tooth. But what disturbs me even more is the unanswered question. What happened to the woman with the wallet? And how many others may have stepped into that clinic, never to walk out the same way again?
Even though I'm a big coward when it comes to anything scary, this has to be the perfect place to share a terrifying incident that involved my cousins and myself about 15 years ago. At the time this happened, I was approaching my 16th birthday. My family had a big reunion every year in Southern California. Since I hadn't attended since I was little, my parents thought it would be a fun way to spend my summer break. It would also be a great opportunity to get to know my cousins. There were 3 of them, and they were all girls around my age. When I thought about it, it sounded fun. So I agreed and flew out the next month to Los Angeles. The reunion was held at the same hotel we were all staying in. When I arrived, I was met by my cousins, Jennifer, Belinda, and Stormy. It was amazing how much alike we all looked. We all had long blonde hair and blue eyes, not to mention our favorite celebrities. But it made sense since our dads were brothers. The biggest difference was how tan they were. Since I had been inside all winter in Minnesota, they were much darker than me. My uncle and dad decided to let us stay in one room together. It was a big, fancy bridal suite. When we saw the room, we came up with this joke that we were sisters, and we were staying in the hotel together for my bachelorette party. I was chosen as the bachelorette because I was the oldest and looked a little different, like an older sister often does. We spent the rest of the day at the pool and talking to guys. Stormy, who was only 14, managed to trick a 25-year-old guy into thinking she was 19 and even gave her his number. We were having so much fun, we stayed up until about 4, talking and laughing. In the morning, which was about noon for most of us, we ordered breakfast and then headed for the pool again. Our day turned out to be even more fun than the one before it. This time Stormy got a pair of twins to buy her lunch. That girl was on fire that week. Later that evening, we all got dressed up and had dinner at the hotel's restaurant. But this time, the story we created had taken on a life of its own. My cousins had been telling guys all day that we were there to party and asking them to buy them drinks. But most of the men were wise enough to know they were lying. After dinner, we joined a cute pair of older guys that were sitting in the lobby when they noticed us leaving the restaurant. They asked us to sit with them, and since we had nothing else to do, we did. Once we sat down, they began asking our ages and names. Of course, we lied and said we were in our early 20s, and they actually believed us. I couldn't help but giggle a bit. This was the most fun I'd had in years. Once the evening started losing its spark, the 2 men asked the 4 of us to go out with them. They wouldn't stop pulling at my arm, no matter how much I resisted. But Stormy, swept away by the fun, not only agreed, but even invited them to our room. But I had to take her aside and remind her that her dad was staying in the room next to ours and would surely not like it. I didn't want to be a stick in the mud, but I wasn't comfortable with having 2 strange men who looked to be around 30 in our room. At that point, it was approaching midnight. I told the 2 younger girls it was time to go back to our room. As we walked away, the 2 men's eyes followed us, cold and calculating, as if they were plotting something sinister. Then we went back upstairs to our room. We stayed up talking about the 2 men and what we were planning on doing when we saw them. That lasted until about 2 a.m. when we decided to go to bed. The lights had just been turned off in the room when we all heard the doorknob start jiggling very fast, like somebody was trying to get in. At first, I thought it was my mind tricking me, but once it started again, I got scared. I asked the other girls if they were also hearing it, and they said yes. Without thinking, Belinda jumped up from her bed and said she would see who it was. I yelled out to stop her from opening the door, but it was too late. Jennifer got up and turned on the lights, and I joined her at the end of the hall. When Belinda opened the door, she turned to us and said no one was there, then stepped out into the hall. That was when we saw a person in a black mask jump out and grab her. As soon as they grabbed her, she began screaming and fighting to get away. All 3 of us, Jennifer, Stormy, and I were also screaming and running for the door to help Belinda. When we made it into the hall, we saw the person was attempting to drag her to the elevator. Even though she was fighting as hard as she could, she was losing and getting closer to the elevator. Thankfully, my uncle came out of his room to see what was going on. He saw Belinda being dragged away and didn't hesitate to attack the masked person. Once he hit them a few times across the head, they dropped her and ran off down the hall. They made it to the stairwell and disappeared. We all ran to her to see if she was okay. She was obviously scared and upset, but thankfully didn't look to be hurt. Once he was sure she was all right, my uncle called hotel security and told them what had just happened. They called the police. The four of us girls just sat there, holding each other and crying. We were all so happy Belinda was safe. Despite the hotel's attempt at catching the person by locking all the doors, the attacker still managed to get away. When the police arrived, we tried our best to describe the attacker, but since they were wearing all black and a mask, we didn't have much to go on. Belinda was pretty sure it was a man, but that was it. Over the rest of the week, we spoke to the police several times and repeated what we had been doing the past couple of days. When my uncle heard about our little inside joke about being in town for a bachelorette party and how we had been lying to the boys about our ages, he was furious. The police told him that one of those boys was most likely the one that had grabbed Belinda. His theory was that they were trying to kidnap one of us to potentially sell us to a trafficker. Since we all looked so much alike, it didn't matter which one of us opened the door. He said girls that looked like us were super popular in the rest of the world, and traffickers would pay top dollar for one of us. We were all so scared, we spent the rest of the week in our room and refused to answer the door for anyone without a key. As soon as the police said it was okay for me to go home, I took the first flight back to Minnesota. I was still scared of strangers for a long time, and had to go to counseling to get over the worst of it. From what my cousins told me later, they did as well, and found it hard to trust boys they had just met. Unfortunately, the police were never able to find Belinda's attacker and punish him for what he had done. It's been a long time since this happened, but whenever we've taken family trips to Disneyland, I've caught myself wondering if one of the men walking around could be the one that tried to kidnap Belinda that night. Then I get a shiver down my spine and remember, it could have just as easily been me. My mother used to work at a hotel in Washington, D.C., back in the 90s. She was a housekeeper, a maid. She needed money because she was a refugee from Vietnam. Even though she didn't know much English at the time, she knew enough to get by at her job. Plus, all the other hotel staff and guests loved her because of how sweet she was. Because of this, anytime high-profile guests such as the Backstreet Boys would come and stay at the hotel, the manager always sent my mom to clean their rooms. One day, a guest came. We'll refer to him as Mr. M. He checked into their most expensive suite. As usual, the manager told my mom to take care of this room. When she got there, there was a "Do not disturb" sign on the door, so she told the manager she'd go back later. What was weird was that no one was ever allowed into Mr. M's room. The man stayed there for over a month, and not once did he let any staff come in to clean. However, he paid a lot, and he always gave a warm welcome every time he passed a staff member or housekeeper, so no one paid him much attention. Then one day, people didn't see him anymore. They assumed he had checked out, even though the receptionist had no record of that. Since it had been so long since the room had been cleaned, the manager told my mom to go and check it out and try to clean up what she could. As she got to the room and unlocked the door, a disturbing smell hit her. She couldn't figure out what it was, but continued to survey the room. It was disgustingly messy. In her words, it looked like someone had thrown a rave, despite the fact that no one else had ever gone into Mr. M's room. It looked like Mr. M had deserted the place without telling anyone. My mom was still shocked by the smell, so she tried to track it down. As she followed it, she realized it was coming from the closet. When she opened it, there was nothing but a cardboard box on the ground. The smell was clearly resonating from it. Her first instinct was to open the box to see what it was and clean it up. But what she found scarred her for life. It was the rotting, decomposing head of a young woman. My mother immediately screamed and got out of there. She fainted in the elevator. When she woke up, the cops were everywhere, and the hotel was like a CI scene. The manager told her that Mr. Me wasn't the guy's real name. He had used a fake credit card to check in. The head of the woman was later identified as that of a call girl. I don't know much more or any of the gritty details, but I'm sure you could look it up on the internet. Needless to say, my mom quit that day.